Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Thanks for having me. It's been an exciting about 12 hours or so that I've been here. I live in Nigeria. I'm not sure how, but I do cover, my work covers all of Sub-Saharan Africa, so I travel quite a bit within the region. I'm going to talk today about my perspective on the topic. It's very simple. I'm going to be talking a lot from my own experiences, and hopefully you guys will be able to take something away from what I'm sharing. All right, so just so that it's not like I'm just talking based on ideas or suppositions, I wanted to share with you that I do have some perspective on the topic. I've happened to live and work in a lot of countries. So I grew up in Canada, I worked in Canada, my first jobs were in Canada, and then I worked in the UK, I've worked in the US, I've lived and worked in India, and I currently live and work in Nigeria. I cover, so far I think I've touched about 29 countries or so in Africa. So it's been, 20 so years of being in different places that are with different types of people, different work environments. But one thing that I've seen across all of these places is, at the end of the day, I think the approach is always very similar. And the earlier conversations touched on that. Openness is always key. And being, open to learning from the other and not being afraid to see differences, but recognizing them just as differences. Not necessarily better or worse, just different. And so some of the things I'll share with you today are about how Sub-Saharan Africa, what I might call often SSA, is a little bit different from what you might be used to. So the first thing is, I think that was touched on earlier, it's a very, very complex region. And I think that's one thing that a lot of companies that find themselves working in Africa really have to deal with, is they come in with this mindset that we're just going to Africa and want to figure out how to work in Ghana, then we've conquered the continent. And it usually doesn't work that way. You could figure out how to work actually in Accra, Ghana, and not know how to work in Tema, Ghana, right? So it's a very complex continent. Earlier I was mentioned maybe the languages might be up to 3,000. I think the number is maybe 1,000, who knows? The reason it's so hard to tell is because there's so many different dialects. So I'm Yoruba, for example. There's so many different Yoruba dialects. And my maternal grandmother's dialect is very different from my paternal grandmother's dialect. They often can't understand each other. So depending on how you define a language, those will be two different languages. And that's why it's often hard to say. But the point is that there are thousands of languages. And with these languages come histories and cultures and experiences that as an outsider coming in, you're oblivious to. Because everybody kind of looks the same, or in most, all countries in Africa speak English, French, Portuguese, with the exception of one or two that speak something else. So you kind of come in thinking, well, they all speak English, so we have some commonalities, but there's actually a lot of differences. Ethnic groups are already covered, it's the same idea around the languages, and then it's an extremely young population. I guess what we're used to when we're talking as businesses anyway, when we're talking to consumers around the world, we're talking usually to people, I think it's between the ages of 18 to 34, right? In Africa, you're usually talking to 20-year-olds. So it's a different kind of language often. 75% of our population is under 35, but that's actually changing fast because we have such a rising population as well. So the numbers at the bottom keep increasing. A very, very young population. And just something to bear in mind when you're going there and how you connect or relate to people is you're going to be talking to young people that in a lot of ways are similar to young people around the world, right? But also in their own ways there are differences. They are African, in a world that's changing, but they're also very passionate about their continent and very connected to their culture. And it's good to kind of have that understanding of this population. So on the good news side, there's a lot of growth in Africa. Some of the fastest growing countries in the world are on the continent. So Ethiopia is the fastest growing country this year at 8.3%. Tanzania is in the top 10 as well, and so is Djibouti. So we have a lot of growth. Economic growth, obviously we're all, generally speaking, coming from a lower base, but that growth is attractive to a lot of organizations kind of rushing in. And it's easy to look at the chart and say, oh, Ethiopia is the fastest growing country in Africa, I'm running there to do business, but then of course there's a lot of realities on the ground that you have to deal with. But that's a positive for us, and then knowing how to address that or use that positive, of course, is the next level. So for us, this is good news, right? We're growing. There's opportunities for businesses. There's opportunities for our people to pull themselves out of poverty by themselves or with, help of organizations from across the world. But there are also a lot of challenges, of course. One of the having trouble. Okay, here we go. So yeah, one of the challenges is the fact that population is rising faster than I think any of our governments are ready to address. So we have a lot of young people coming into the workforce without much to do. And that's one of the things, reason why we focus on digital skills, so that young people can actually start their own businesses and not only create employment for themselves, but also hire people. So I already talked about earlier, and I'm glad our numbers completely match. I always worry about that. So we're at 1.1 billion today. By 2050, it'll be 2.4 billion, right? So very, very fast rise in population. And almost all of that growth from Africa is coming from Sub-Saharan Africa, so the specific part of the world that we're talking about today. By 2034, we're expected to have the largest working age population in the world. So we're fastest rising, and we're going to be the largest in less than 20 years, right? It could be an opportunity, but it's also a potential challenge if we're not creating employment opportunities for these people, right? So I think we talked about this a little at breakfast today about, there's a lot of young people across the continent not really doing much. They're not necessarily productive. But a lot of times, it's easy to see that, but what we're not seeing, I think what we miss a lot of times is that there are very limited opportunities to channel that productivity. And so that's, for me, one of the big opportunities for people that are thinking of doing business in Africa is how do you leverage the energy and the creativity of young people to actually create value for, your organization, but also for themselves and their communities. And I think that takes, some creative thinking. It takes a lot of openness to doing business a little bit differently with them, but also just making sure that the goal kind of focuses on channeling that energy. I think if we're able to do that successfully, then we'll get the best out of this workforce. If not, I think there are potential challenges that necessarily impact the rest of the world. One of the kind of, bothersome stats that I've seen that the UN shared recently is they did this survey of young people that joined rebel movements. And 40% of them, the reason they gave was that they didn't have any economic opportunities. So it's either they actually didn't have the opportunities or they just perceived that they didn't. Either way, they're joining these movements because they're thinking, this is the only path to the future for me, right? So they're not seeing a positive future or a future where they actually can be a creative member of society. And I think if there's any problem that the world needs to look at trying to solve, this is it. Because this population affects the rest of the world. So making sure we're channeling that energy and helping young people see the potential for themselves to create their own futures, I think is critical. There's a bit of a delay here. All right, so business. So how is it different from my experience? There are very few differences. Like I said, all these places I've worked, I haven't had to change myself. My approach has generally worked. So I don't think it's so drastic that, in fact, there was a time when I was moving to India, we had cultural training at work. I was working in a different company then. And the cultural training, I thought that was so interesting, was a 2 full-day training where we're trained on how to talk to people, how to walk on the street, how to behave at dinner. And the whole time you're there they're just people. If we just go there and be humble and just learn from them, maybe we won't need 2 days of training. You might want to know some basics, right? But I think the differences are not as stark often as we think they are. But I'll point out kind of the simple ones that I think are just important to be aware of, because that helps in kind of when you approach people, when you approach businesses in Africa, to think about that. And this is coming from a perspective of working mostly with the users or the consumers. So this is kind of how I have seen people in general operate in Africa. And when I say Africa, take that with a grain of salt. Like I said, very diverse. So oftentimes when I'm saying Africa, it's very prevalent in Ghana, but not so much in Nigeria. Sometimes it's something that happens a lot in South Africa, but not so much in Kenya. But these are kind of general ideas about kind of, similarities that you'll see across countries. So the first thing is networking. So when I went to business school in the US, and when we network in the US, it's actually a formal networking thing, right? You're going to have a networking event, and your goal there is to network. You go to a conference, and you're going to network. You make sure you take your business cards with you to network. And those people actually call you, or they'll send you an email if you get in touch with them afterwards. That really doesn't happen in Nigeria. And I'll use Nigeria as an example because that one is my everyday experience. So going to a conference and meeting someone and giving them your card doesn't mean anything. Networking in Africa is building relationships. And the way you build relationships is about caring about the things they care about. So some examples here. If someone you're doing business with is getting married, better go to their wedding, right? Or if their cousin is getting married, go to the cousin's wedding. So weddings in a lot of parts of Africa is easily thousands of people attending because of these kinds of connections. So that's where those conversations happen. It's very, very typical for people that work across industries in Africa to have meetings at night at 11 at somebody's house over drinks, right? So these are valid business meetings. They're just done differently. Church is another one, or mosque, so religious centers. Africans in general are religious people, so if you're part of that community, then you have a higher chance of having those relationships and building those connections. So networking is something that one needs to think about a little differently when you're trying to work in Africa. The next thing is the concept of community is very important across our cultures. So we're more and more becoming more individualistic. We're seeing that more, especially with young people kind of being connected to the rest of the world. But at the core, for even the young people, being accepted in society is really important. Doing kind of what we do as a society or as a culture is really important. So thinking of that concept of community is always kind of, you're almost there when you're having a conversation with someone and you're realizing that you're not just talking to this person, you're talking to them and anybody else that is within the immediate group. So, for example, in South Africa, there's a concept of Ubuntu. Ubuntu means I exist because we all exist, essentially. So without the group, I'm not really anything. And a lot of people believe that. And so when you're having a conversation with someone and you think they might be the decision maker in a business sense, a lot of times they may not actually commit to anything until they've gotten the okay of the immediate community, whatever that community is that is important to them. So it's important to understand that. That oftentimes will mean extended family members, depending on the kind of conversation you're having. Sometimes it's just the work group, for example, and sometimes it's even larger. So if you're talking to people that are a member of an association, for example, they may not commit to anything until the entire association is comfortable with that idea. So when you're selling something to someone in Africa, you want to be making a case that is useful for an entire community, not just that individual. Another concept that I think is important is hierarchy. So I work for an American company that's, been in Africa for a while. I've been in my job for close to 6 years. And the company culture is very flat. The organization is a flat organization. I can walk to, anyone at any level and have a conversation. Now, in most parts of Africa, that's not usually the case. There's usually the boss, right? And beside the boss, there's like the different levels of bosses that follow. One of the things that I found odd when I first started in this role is when you go to a meeting and you get there, they ask you kind of like what your order of seniority is, because that's going to determine how you sit at the meeting. So if there are three of you, you essentially line up according to your seniority, and then the most senior person sits with the most senior person from the other side. So these concepts are really important to people. And the way you kind of marry that is, I don't think you need to change how your organization works, but having that understanding means you think about roles and responsibilities and making it clear to people you're doing business with who's making decisions, for example. Because saying we all kind of, we're all in a democracy and we all kind of figure it out together doesn't usually work. And that's maybe why democracy struggles in Africa, but that's for another day. But we like to know who's in charge and who's the boss. It's important. Another thing that I think is important to kind of keep in mind is gender and gender differences. One thing that I do find quite heartwarming or interesting is this, the World Bank recently found that 61% of women in Sub-Saharan Africa are participating in the workforce there, and that's one of the highest rates in the world. So on that side, I mean, it's exciting and it's impressive. It's not something you'd expect, right? You expect African women are sitting at home and rearing the kids, but no, they're working. But what kind of work are they doing? That's usually the difference, right? Women typically are not as educated as men because historically, in a poor family, if they have to choose between sending a boy to school and a girl to school, they're usually going to send the boy to school. So women typically are not as educated as the men. Women in healthcare are still lagging behind the rest of the world. So we still have a very high rate of mortality in terms of diseases that impact women of childbearing age. So there are challenges that women deal with. And the way they're often reflected in the workforce is that the women are not, or may come across as not as productive. So you have women that work, but they're not decision makers often. They don't usually have influence often. And so just bearing that in mind also is important to know. It's changing, and some countries are doing better than others. But I think for me, when I go to meetings we work a lot of partners across the region. And there's some countries when I go to a meeting, before I get there, I'm asking who's coming to the meeting. If it's all men, I ask for women to join. Because you want that perspective, because oftentimes they're just not naturally going to be there. And I think it's just worth considering or being aware of that. The next point is so as a society or as an organization, you have your own values. And I think as the professor mentioned earlier, there's a temptation to think your values are kind of the way the world should work. But the reality is often different in many places, right? So in many countries in Africa, for example, homosexuality is against the law. It means people actually go to prison if they're suspected of being homosexual. Right? So this is something that we grapple with as an organization. An example here, during the Sochi Olympics, Google had a global doodle that was essentially celebrating homosexuality. So it's a company where we're open and we obviously accept everyone. But in Nigeria, it's not something we talk about much, right? Because you want employees that may or may not be gay to feel like they're protected, right? Because if it's against the law, then they essentially get in trouble for being open. And so just being aware that there are situations where what you believe and how you do things is not always aligned with kind of how things work in that place. And, we have our own perspectives and what we hope would happen, but the reality is kind of what the reality is. And just realizing that we need to work within that context. A lot of other examples, even in Nigeria, for example, the age at which it's legal for a girl to get married is a lot lower than I think most of us will want. But it is what the law is, right? And so it's just good to understand and kind of like figure out how your values kind of can work within that context. I just wanted to mention a couple other things. There's always going to be nuances. There's always going to be things that you bump into and you kind of like maybe raise an eyebrow because it's kind of odd. Different countries or even different towns and cities will be different. For me, when I first started working in Nigeria, I think what was interesting to me was we will start meetings typically when we go out to have meetings with a prayer. And Nigeria is about 50-50 Muslims and Christians. So a lot of times you start with a prayer, and a Christian prayer, and then you close with a Muslim prayer. So we're balanced, right? And I thought that was interesting. But like I said, it's these things that they're different. They don't necessarily impact how business is done. It's just kind of how things are done. Another thing that I found interesting was when I worked in the US, around Christmas time, we don't wish people Merry Christmas because I don't want to offend you because you might not be Christian, so I'll say Happy Holidays. In Nigeria, it doesn't matter what your religion is. We're going to wish you Merry, Happy, whatever that holiday is, right? So when it's Salah time for Muslims, everybody wishes everybody Barakah de Salah. And when it's Christmas time, everybody wishes everybody Merry Christmas, right? So if it's something you're sensitive to, being aware that this is just how it's done there is important. I think at the end of the day, for me, it's really just knowing these differences or being open to the fact that things might come your way that you haven't experienced before, but quickly chalking it up to, well, it's different, right? And obviously, it's always good to have a local person that can explain the context to you as well. There's one question that always kills me in Nigeria till now is when you see people in the morning, when people say good morning, they say, good morning, how was your night? Your face. Now, that's a very odd question to me, but it's something that we're used to. And I even ask people sometimes, how was your night? Right? So it's just, again, very, very unique to that place, but it's just how people do things. A couple things that I thought it would be important to just keep in mind and consider as we think more about globalization and working kind of cross-culturally. So virtual work is obviously becoming more and more predominant. I mean, there's a lot of people here that will do business in Africa without actually physically meeting some of the people they will do business with. While that has its benefits, obviously there are efficiencies there. To me, the most important thing is to recognize that you can't successfully do business without building trust. And it's very difficult to build trust via Skype. I think meeting the people, feeling the soil, being on ground is critical. And if I can't tell you how many times I've had people reach out to me for a conversation. They're sitting somewhere in the world and they have this brilliant idea and they've seen it work in Thailand and they want to do it somewhere in Africa and they want my perspective. I share with them and I say, when are you coming to visit? I don't plan to visit. Well, you're probably not going to be a successful business, right? You have to visit. You have to spend time with people. People have to know you. People have to be able to look into your eyes to trust you before they can do business with you. So obviously, once you've built that relationship, then kind of leveraging technology for some of the other work makes sense, but building those relationships are critical. And in fact, just one other point on that, not only building, even in maintaining, people will tell you, I haven't seen you in a long time. And they actually mean see, they don't mean talk to you on the phone. So there is that requirement to kind of regularly see people. The other thing is, and I think we kind of touched on this a little bit earlier, is just keeping in mind just being a good human being. So ethical principles are critical. I think, we've seen, obviously, this picture is actually from the movie The Constant Gardener. Has anyone seen that? So there's this movie where, it's fiction, but, we could translate a lot of it to real life, where a company from a different part of the world was testing a drug for tuberculosis, but they figured African lives are a lot cheaper, so let's test it there. The movie happens. But I think, that's a stark example, but there are examples of that happening every day where the value of an African life is not thought to be the same as someone else in another part of the world. And I think if we all think back to even recent examples, we can bring up some. So in situations of when there's a terrorist attack, right? If 10 people die in a certain part of the world versus 100 people in Africa, it's usually not reacted to the same way, right? So, and I think it's just constantly being aware of the fact that people are people, humans are humans, regardless of how much they have in their bank account, and coming at people with that level of respect and regard. And not just the individuals, but also society. So we have a lot of examples, obviously, of things around pollution and things like that across Africa where companies do things that they can't do in other parts of the world, right? So again, same approach. If you won't do it in another part of the world because you'll get in trouble, why do it in Africa? And I'll end on this note. I think back to what I alluded to earlier, I haven't had to change. I haven't had to change much working in India or working in the US or now across the region. I think, just understanding what your goals are as an individual, as an organization, being very clear on what the goals are, and then practicing, to me, what the three most important things is. One, being humble enough to understand that you don't have all the answers, humble enough to understand that your way, even though it works for you or has worked for centuries, can be different from someone else's way. So that humility, I think, is important, and people sense that. A lot of times you see people come tell you, well, why do you guys do things this way? It's not efficient for you, right? There's a reason why it's done a certain way in other places. And just having the humility to be open to understand what might be driving that, I think, is important. The other thing is just simple humanity, right? Kind of touched on that already. Just seeing the people you're dealing with on ground as your equals. And finally, just honesty, being honest about what your goals are. One thing I've seen a lot is no matter what it is that your goal is, if you're honest about it, people will help you to get there, right? In fact, I had this conversation with someone not too long ago who seemed like they were kind of trying to devise their way to something, but weren't being very honest about it. And we had the conversation about if you say this is what I'm trying to get to, people will line up behind you and they will help you get it. As long as obviously it's legal, right? Obviously it's legal and it benefits society, right? And for most people's goals, they usually are, right? So I think just being open about what you're trying to achieve, goes a long way. Obviously to people trusting you, but also for you just being able to work in that region for the long haul. You might win in the beginning, but once people figure out you're not to be trusted, that's kind of the end of it. So being honest enough to earn their trust and maintain it is important. And that's it for me. I hope that was helpful.